Ancient literature is divided into four: folk tale or folklore, two, legend, three, a myth, and four, historical. What is the meaning of these? Are there features that we can identify? A folk tale, there is no attempt to state a real or true story. So we have maybe the sun smiling on you and the breeze coming by and whispering a secret in your ear, or the birds and the animals all meeting as a big committee meeting. They know it's not at all true. The main intent is to be interesting and bring out a lesson or a moral. So in the question of a folk tale or a folklore, there is no real attempt to state a true story. When it comes to a legend, this is probably based on a real and true story. But changes slowly creep in. Exaggerations and embellishments to superhuman proportions. And when do these changes come in? They begin generations after the event, when there are no longer any eyewitnesses left to challenge your change. And the time period is usually centuries. The key really here is that a legend cannot be made in the same generation as the event or the story. Generations must pass before somebody adds and exaggerates. And why do we say time period as centuries? Here's an example. In relationship to the story of Gautama Buddha, there was a medallion that was carved by an artist, and this is what is said about that medallion. This medallion dates back certainly to the 2nd century BC. If we put the Buddha's nirvana or death during the 5th century, so the gap is 3 centuries, 300 years, then the artist who carved the medallion must have lived at a time when the memory of the Blessed One, that was Gautama Buddha, was still very fresh in the minds of the people. In other words, 300 years later, his story was still fresh. It takes centuries for real changes to creep in to form a legend. A myth is so far back in history that it is generally accepted as somebody's imagination. The story is probably not true. The characters are probably fictitious, and it usually involves the supernatural world. The time period here is many centuries and even millennia, thousands of years. When it comes to the historical, the attempt is to state a real, true story. There are no significant additions and no core changes over any period of time. Now, all ancient writings do have changes. There is not a single one that does not have some changes. The question really is, did those changes affect the main theme of the story, or were they only peripheral issues? And the closer to the event the writing is, the greater the credibility. On the screen you see certain letters: EV, OT, WT, and EM. EV is the event, and the dash is the time period between the event and OT, which is the oral tradition. Anytime any peculiar, unusual event took place, the community would make it into a story, and that is called the oral tradition. And they would pass it on from generation to the next. Generation to generation. That is the oral tradition. Then after a few generations, somebody would think, oh, we might forget the real story. So he writes it down, and it becomes the written tradition now. And there's a gap between the event and the oral tradition, a gap between the oral tradition and the written tradition. And the fact now is that we do not have a single original manuscript. All we have are copies. So there's another gap between the original manuscript, which we have described as the written tradition, and the earliest manuscript, EM. If the gaps are wide, then the credibility of this historical piece of literature goes down. If the gaps are very close, the credibility goes up. With this description, let's see how the writings fair. Hinduism, the Rig Veda is probably the earliest writing of the Hindus, followed by the next three Veda texts, the Vedic texts, and then an anthology, the Upanishads, and then an epic or a large story called the Ramayana, in which Rama is the hero, and then another epic, the Mahabharata, in which is found the Bhagavad Gita and Krishna. Look at the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita. Lord Krishna first spoke Bhagavad Gita to the sun god some hundreds of millions of years ago. Now, that is really too far for any of us to go and check. And so it pushes this story towards the mythological. It was lost, the Bhagavad Gita, 100 million years ago. And then it came back to the human race about 3000 BC, at the beginning of the present age of the Hindus, which is Kali Yuga. But it still is 3000 BC, 5000 years ago. Once again, thousands of years unable to go and check for ourselves. And so we find that in a writing known, for example, called the Ultimate Encyclopedia of Mythology, we find these words: Krishna, according to Hindu mythology, is an avatar or an incarnate of Vishnu, the preserver of the universe. So most scholars accept the Hindu writings in these stories to be mythological accounts. Buddhism, I'm going to mention 4 statements in chronological order. The first one, the humanity of the Buddha is also expressed by a Theravada monk. A Theravada monk is one who lived during the time of Gautama Buddha. And he said, was he not born at Lumbini? Did he not complete existence at Kusinara? In other words, he was born here and he died here just like anybody else. Statement 2. Soon after the passing of the Master, a change began to set in. A change comes in. Statement number 3. At the beginning of the Christian era, the transcendental nature of the Buddha became more and more pronounced. In other words, 500 years later, we find some significant changes coming in. This transcendental nature. Now he is being lifted up from being an ordinary individual to somebody superhuman. The 4th statement is from the Mahayana literature, which is 700 to 1000 years later. There is not much of the man left in the Buddha. He is now an exalted being who has lived for countless ages in the past and will continue to live forever. Did you see the change? From the earliest writing of somebody who was contemporary with Buddha, who said he was born here, he died here just like anybody else. 700 years later, he has always lived in the past and will always live in the future. A change in a story. Therefore, it would be reasonable for us to say that the story of Gautama Buddha falls into the category of a legend. Judaism, the Torah, the law, the writings and the prophets are divided now into 39 books with so many different authors living at vastly different periods of history. Some writings to me appeared questionable in the sense of historicity, others were accurately historical. I didn't go into much detail at that point because I was hoping to put them into one classification. I could not. So I left the Judaic writing unclassified as to this point. There are other ways in which you can look at it, but for this moment, I just left it unclassified. Islam, the Quran was put together in writing by 652 CE, Common Era, within 20 years of Muhammad's life. So just about the same generation. Only some changes in the text are accepted by scholars. I am being liberal in the sense that actually there were questions. There were variant readings during the third caliphate, which means the third ruler after Muhammad. And his name is Uthman, he ordered that it be consolidated into one with the help of some excellent scholars. So he called them and they made a the present-day Quran. The unfortunate thing we find is that he ordered all the other manuscripts and readings destroyed. So in one sense, we cannot really go back to see what was there from which the present Quran has been brought together. However, it was within the lifetime or one generation of Muhammad, and therefore we have to acknowledge that it is most probably, and should give it the classification of historical piece of literature. Christianity, the earliest manuscript we have, is dated about 114 to 134 AD in the John Rylands library in UK. The original manuscripts were written within 20 to 50 years of the life of Jesus. And this is the New Testament writings. The actual earliest writing, which can be classified as a Christian writing, is not in the Bible. It was found recently by a Jewish archaeologist. His name was Eliezer L. Sukenik. He was doing his archaeological digs at the same period as the 1st century AD, and he came across some tombs. And with the help of some coins next to the tombs, they dated those tombs to before AD 41, within 10 years of the life of Jesus. And on the tomb, on one tomb, was the word, Jesus is God. And on the second tomb, it appeared like a prayer to Jesus, the ascended one. So the gap was from the event to the oral tradition to the written tradition, which was only 10 years, which really can be called no gap at all. And was all confined to one generation, and today there are no real core changes in the story. We can already say emphatically that there is no longer any solid basis for dating any book of the New Testament after about AD 80. And that is Sir William Albright, who was one of the greatest archaeologists from America. Nelson Gluck, a Jewish archaeologist, has this to say about the Bible. It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. That is saying a lot about a book that states that it wants to write down real history. Sir William Ramsay was another archaeologist, a British archaeologist, who was also doing his archaeological work at that same period of time. He had discarded the New Testament and was doing his digs when he came across some very perplexing situations, and he consulted one document after another. And finally, out of thinking that maybe the New Testament might help him, he went to Luke, the book of Acts. And there he found statements that cleared his perplexity. This happened over and over again. And over a period of 30 years, he found that Luke was stating some things that were accurate. And this is what he wrote about Luke. Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect of its trustworthiness. This author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians, not religious historians, very greatest of historians. Norman Geisler, one of Christianity's apologists, says this: in all, Luke names 32 countries, 54 cities, 9 islands without a single error. This is unusual when it comes to mythological and legendary stories. So with these features, we can recognize that the New Testament has very high credibility of being a historical piece of literature.